Kia ora, I'm Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. Church leaders are continuing to publicly apologise to survivors of abuse. The Presbyterian Church is the latest to address it in two public apology events. The first was in Dunedin at the weekend, and the next is in Auckland this Saturday. It's the latest in a series of public apologies from church and public sector leaders after the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in Care. Over 5 years of investigations, the inquiry heard nearly 3,000 survivor accounts of abuse and neglect. The more than 130 recommendations focused on creating a new independent redress system, strengthening the care system, and holding institutions accountable. Today on The Front Page, lawyer Amanda Hill has represented abuse and care survivors and is with us to explain how the process is working and how it's not. First off, Amanda, tell me how you think the redress scheme is going so far.
Well, I guess one of the challenges is that there's no single redress scheme. There are many different schemes, some good, some bad, some ugly. There is a lot of talk and work around redress, but there's a big gaping hole in the middle, and that's the government's decision not to proceed with the Royal Commission's key recommendations around an independent scheme. So if I was standing back and looking at the biggest problem with redress or the biggest lack of progress, it would be the government decisions around that. And so everything else sort of pales in comparison to that, but I also acknowledge that there's organisations who are doing their best without that government support.
So if that independent scheme would have gone ahead, it would just be a blanket rule or a blanket thing across all of them. But at the moment, what we've got is different redress schemes for different institutions and whether they be state-based or faith-based.
Yes. So the idea behind the independent scheme, which the Royal Commission called Poritumu Tora Whānui, was to provide a sort of a single scheme that dealt with abuse in state care, faith-based care, schools, everything, and that there would be buy-in from faith-based organisations, so they'd become part of that scheme, which meant that there was transparency, independence, accountability. Everyone knew what the rules were, but with the decision not to proceed with that, what the government's done is trying to even up the various processes within government, which are wildly inconsistent, and to trying to do a bit of work inside their own house, but leaving faith-based organisations to forge ahead on their own. So we still have lots of different things going on.
Has the horse bolted in that respect? Is it too late to put that in place now?
Not at all. Not at all. I think there will always be an opportunity for a single independent scheme, and the current situation in terms of state matters is very patchy, but there will always be an opportunity to bring in Poritumu Tora Whānui. So while we're pretty gutted with the decisions right now, there will always be work to try and bring that about.
What are some of the roadblocks that survivors are finding themselves up against?
There is still, I think, a real lack of belief around the scale and nature of abuse in care. There is still real difficulty around access to records, although there's been quite a lot of good work in that space. There is still a real lack of understanding of what good redress looks like. And in New Zealand, the compensation levels in particular are punishingly low. And that's partly reflective of the role of ACC, which means that you can't sue for general or compensatory damages. But it is a really... the approach is often superficial, not always understanding what the impact on survivors is, not understanding that abuse has lifelong impacts, and just sort of thinking that if you parcel something up and hand it over, that's done. Whereas what we know is that redress is a journey rather than an event.
Budget 2025 saw $774 million put aside to improve the state abuse redress scheme. Is that enough?
It's hard to tell because it really depends on where that money is going. There is a backlog of claims within the Ministry of Social Development and the Ministry of Education. So some of that is just about getting work done that hasn't been done yet. It's not necessarily about, when I say improving, they mean not making people wait 5 years, because that's the current wait time.
Wow.
And some of it is lifting up some compensation, which has been very low, lifting them up to a slightly higher level. So how that money is parcelled up is probably, I don't have the information around what that's being applied to, but I know there have been top-ups for some people who have resolved their claims, particularly with social development. That's been really good for them. But when your top-up sort of only takes you to a reasonably low amount, that's still, when you stand back and look at the bigger picture, it's still pretty hard. But there is, I call it tinkering. I think a lot of the work being done is tinkering. When you're trying to improve something that's so badly broken, you sort of go, well, what's the cost of just actually starting again?
And I mean, one of the major questions to come out of the inquiry as well, I suppose, is how do you quantify someone's abuse?
And you can't. What you often hear from particularly organisations where abuse has been perpetrated is no amount of money can fix this harm. But the end of that sentence really needs to be, but we'll give it our best shot. And often that's not what's happening. And so this thing of no amount of money can fix the harm means that they don't really put any effort into trying. There are some ways you can quantify harm. And so when you look at things like assessing perhaps someone's lost opportunity, lost wages, so the loss of potential earnings scheme through ACC is one of those measures. We look at, have you been able to parent? Have you been able to hold down a job? Do you have mental health, drug, alcohol issues? Again, it's hard to quantify, but it has been done. You look overseas and there are plenty of jurisdictions where it's been done. So it's not like we're starting from scratch. There is a whole jurisprudence around this.
How is it for survivors being able to access their redress payments reliably? And you mentioned a 5-year wait time at the moment. Why is it taking so long?
Partly, one of the challenges will always be with state processes is that it's the state investigating itself. It's MSD looking at, did its own staff members cause harm? And there's not really any motivation to do that quickly. So there's been a dragging of feet over a long period of time. There have been multiple changes to processes. There's been so many different ways that redress has been administered, and some clunkier than others. But really, there's just not been the resourcing, the staffing, or the motivation to resolve claims quickly. And so they've built up because I think the state never realised or recognised just how many victims there were, whereas the Royal Commission was very clear that a huge number of people in state and faith-based care were abused.
One name that comes to mind when thinking about the inquiry is, of course, Lake Alice. As of last month, RNZ reported 141 people have been ruled eligible for the Lake Alice redress scheme, with 102 of those opting to receive a $150,000 payment. Some have decided to go to arbitration. Can you explain to us what that means?
Sure. I guess the first thing to note, though, is that this Lake Alice process is limited to people who are in the child and adolescent unit run by Dr. Selwyn Leeks and who suffered ECT in an unmodified form of electroshock therapy or the use of a drug called paraldehyde. So this is a very targeted group of people rather than the larger group of Lake Alice or other psychiatric institutions. So it's a microcosm, really. And it came about because of the United Nations finding that what happened there was torture, met the definition of torture. So that's the first thing. It's a smaller group. The process for those people is either, but there's a pathway effectively. Arbitration doesn't mean something's failed. It means that they get to choose. And so the first pathway, as you say, a payment of $150,000, that's an expedited payment. So that happens quite quickly. And that comes with an apology and some help with services and things like that. If people want to take a more individual approach, those meetings have occurred now with an independent arbitrator who's a retired High Court judge. And that means that they get to meet someone and talk about their experiences and have a more personalised and tailored approach, which suits some survivors. They want to go down that road. Others, and particularly this cohort, they're often sick, they're very old, they need the money for whatever reason, and digging through those memories is hard. So this option of either a fairly fast approach, recognising that you meet the eligibility criteria, or the arbitration where you may receive a higher amount, but you go through this process, that provides some tailored options for survivors.
And I understand the deadline for the expedited pathway is tomorrow, Tuesday, September 30th. What does this mean?
So my understanding is that because this was a time-limited process, and that was a decision made by Cabinet, that if someone hasn't registered with the Crown Response Unit by the 30th of September, then that payment won't be available to them. There's a couple of steps that need to be taken to be eligible for that scheme. So yes, there will come a point where some people who haven't been involved in that process may miss out.
That doesn't seem fair at all.
It isn't fair to the people who haven't been involved. And one of the challenges sometimes is that the expectation that survivors will put their hand up to go through this process, and that they'll have the ability to engage with, in this case, government. There's been a lot of help given to survivors, and myself and other lawyers are appointed as panel lawyers, and there's been some really good support provided. But again, they have to come to the scheme. The scheme doesn't come to them. The state, they know the names of the people who are in the child and adolescent unit. So there's no proactive reaching out to people. And that's where the challenges lie, because what we know is that some of the people from Lake Alice are some of the most damaged survivors that I've ever met, and they've suffered so much harm, and their ability to engage with schemes to ring. Government is a scary thing when you've been harmed so badly, and to re-engage with government and to put yourself in that position again is a really hard thing. So there are real challenges around that.
And so if people haven't come forward, of those who haven't come forward already as of tomorrow, is government kind of relieved of any responsibility? That's
a really good question. And that's a bit of an unknown, to be honest. And I think if there is another cohort of survivors, the minister may have to make some decisions there, because the scheme is running for a particular time. Cabinet have designated that time. The arbiter's job is time limited, and what happens after that, I think it remains to be seen, but that may be a political decision more than anything else.
Today I'm apologising on behalf of the government to everyone who suffered abuse, harm and neglect while in state care. Today, make this apology to all survivors on behalf of my own and previous governments. You deserved so much better, and I am deeply sorry that New Zealand did not do better by you. I am sorry that you were not believed when you came forward to report your abuse. I am sorry that many bystanders, staff, volunteers and carers turned a blind eye and failed to stop or report abuse.
I see that the Presbyterian Church is publicly apologising in Auckland this weekend. They did so in Dunedin last weekend, and I've noticed the church used the phrase holistic redress. Is that different to redress? Can you explain to me what that means?
Sure. So I think that often means different things to different organisations. So there's no single approach. But I guess when we talk about redress, it responds to all of the harm rather than, an element of redress is compensation. It's money. But redress can also means an apology. It also means making sure someone can access independent legal advice. So, and often paying legal costs, counselling or other support. I know for some schemes, access to facilitators to help you navigate your entitlements with ACC, for example. ACC is an enormous barrier for survivors. It's incredibly difficult to navigate. Lifelong help with parenting, with all sorts of things. So when I talk about redress or healing being a journey rather than an event, that's what I mean. The supply of services over time is really, really important.
And so the holistic part of it could mean any range of things.
Yes, yeah. Whatever, and this is what a good redress responds to the survivor in front of you. It responds to their needs and what they want, and it's a conversation rather than going, here's your money, see you later, you're done. There is much more to be gained through holistic redress than a fairly transactional approach.
Have any other faiths set up their own redress process? And if so, what do they look like? How do they compare?
Different churches or faith-based organisations have different processes and have for many years. The Salvation Army has had a process over many years, and that was often run by one person out of the Salvation Army. Again, those challenges of investigating your own people and the lack of independence there. During the Royal Commission, it caused some organisations to give themselves a hard look and to revise what they were doing. Some have done that better than others, but so every organisation has a different approach, and it's often in a state of flux, so it's changing a great deal. And I think a lot of organisations were waiting for the final report of the Royal Commission, Whanaketia, which was issued last year, and sort of took a lot out of that. But lots of them were waiting for the state to implement an independent scheme and just had gone, right, we'll hang in there until this is going to happen. And now without that, I think they are looking at their own schemes and taking steps. As I say, a wide range of responses and wide range of schemes.
How does the redress compare between state-based and faith-based? Is it better on either side, or do both sides have kind of positives and negatives?
It varies wildly, and this is what I mean about the lack of consistency. There are some organisations that sort of don't easily fit. So when I think about really good redress schemes, you look at something like Dilworth School up in Auckland. There was an independent inquiry and discovered a culture of sexual abuse at the school over many years. An extraordinary number of boys in the school sexually abused over a long period of time. And Dilworth instituted a process that was independent of the school. Nothing's perfect, but it was a pretty good process. And the compensation paid by Dilworth was far and away above anything that the state had ever offered. At the other end, some Catholic orders, very, very limited redress, almost grudging, I think is probably a word to use, and other organisations not engaging at all. So it's hard to compare because they're so different. But to give you an example, someone who had experienced sexual abuse at Dilworth could receive compensation of, say, $200,000. Someone in state care who had experienced the same abuse or potentially abuse for a longer period of time might get $30,000 or $40,000. That's what that difference looks like.
In terms of these institutions, I'm sure that, and you've spoken to a lot of survivors as well, does it feel like if we pay this person this lump sum, this will all go away?
I think it feels like that to some organisations, but I think what I've seen over time is that when people, and often I've seen this in people coming in new to some organisations, when they meet survivors and they see them face to face and they hear what happened to them and they hear what their adult life has been like, and that, a lot of my clients have huge challenges as adults, and they see this person in front of them, and sometimes survivors will bring photos of what they were like when they were kids, and that's really impactful for organisations, because it's real easy to see this person in front of you as someone who is a challenge to how you do things. And lots of organisations want to be organisations that are doing great things in the community. They're helpful, they are doing the right thing, they're morally upright. And to have this person saying, your staff hurt me and your organisation never stepped in to help. Or even worse, in terms of some of the Catholic organisations, you knew and you moved the priest to somewhere else. And that is really hard for organisations to hear. But some of them have, to their credit, recognised that you can't just package it up and send it on its way, and that you have to be more accountable. And that's to their credit, but I think we've got quite a long way to go. And
in terms of public apologies, I suppose different survivors will feel different things about public apologies. But what are some of the thoughts and feelings that you've heard from survivors about them?
We always have to be careful. Survivors are not a homogenous group. And you're right, it means different things to different people. And I think when I think back to the apology delivered in Parliament, and I was at Parliament for that, and there was a range of emotions from people feeling like it sort of released them from a lot of the hurt, the whakama, the mai that they've been carrying for years. That they felt that sort of brought that to an end for them in a way. And others, perhaps a bit more cynical, perhaps going, right, well, an apology is empty without meaningful action with it. And at that point, the government was saying, we're looking at redress, we're looking at what we can do. But there wasn't anything concrete with the apology. And I think people who have been let down by those organisations so often just wanted to sort of go, okay, well, you said sorry. Now, what does that look like? The full range of responses there.
And lastly, Amanda, if you could change one thing tomorrow without no qualms about money or legal processes or laws or legislation or time or anything, what would it be?
I would implement the Royal Commission's recommendations to bring in a single independent scheme. It would bring in all of the different organisations under one roof. It would mean that survivors didn't have to go to 3 or 4 different organisations because they were placed in different places as kids. I would make sure it was consistent and transparent and accountable, and there was a one-stop place where people could go. And if we have it all there, the Royal Commission has presented this, and we just need to implement it.
Why isn't it happening?
Political will, I think, isn't there. There is some work happening, but like I say, it is picking low-hanging fruit. It is tinkering. It's not acknowledging that the state, and someone said this, I think it was a High Court judge said this many years ago, the abuser cannot be the saviour. You cannot fix your own house. It has to be taken out of the organisations, dealt with independently.
Thanks for joining us, Amanda.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is produced by Jane Yee and Richard Martin, who is also our editor. I'm Chelsea Daniels. Subscribe to The Front Page on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts, and tune in tomorrow for another look behind the headlines.